I always believed that my wife, Clara, was the sort of woman who kept her vows sealed tighter than a bank's vault. We had been through so much, the two of us, ever since we were barely more than kids playing at being adults. We were both 19 when we got married, two optimistic dreamers who thought the world was ours for the taking. Our families told us we were too young. Well, in a sense, they were right. We were naive. But we stayed together for nearly 4 decades, through ups and downs that tested us in ways few would have the heart to endure. The harsh knowledge that I was wrong about our bond, that all my faith in her loyalty was misplaced, still stings. I never imagined, after 38 years, that I would come home to the final act of betrayal by the only woman I ever loved. She believed I was gone for good. The details behind her assumption are complicated, and I never told them to anyone other than the investigators, the rescue team, and eventually my sons. But I will tell it here, plainly and without theatrics, because my story deserves to be known in its full, unvarnished truth. For years, I worked as a freelance architectural consultant, traveling to distant construction sites and city planning offices. In my younger days, I would pull on a hard hat, examine scaffolding, and sketch new angles to improve structural layouts in the blistering sun. Once I entered my 60s, the on-site demands lessened, and I was more of a behind-the-scenes advisor. The job was lucrative enough for Clara and me to enjoy a cozy home and help send our 2 sons off to college with minimal debt. We had a comfortable routine. She was a retired librarian turned volunteer coordinator, organizing book drives and reading programs for the local community center. She thrived on that sense of purpose, and I admired her for it. Our life was stable, predictable, until that last assignment. I had been hired to consult on the renovation of an old coastal mansion in a remote peninsula region. The property was battered by decades of storms and owned by a family who wanted to restore it to its original glory. I arrived for a week's stay to take detailed notes, meet with local construction workers, and propose an implementation plan. The second day there, a vicious tropical storm blew in, drenching the entire coastline. The wind howled like something out of an apocalyptic tale, twisting trees and ripping shingles off roofs. We were used to storms, but no one expected the rock slide along the coastal cliff. I was driving back along the narrow road that ran parallel to the ocean when the rock slide buried my rental car. I remember hearing the roar of tumbling boulders, feeling the vehicle swerve uncontrollably. Then, just blackness. I came to hours later, pinned in the wreck. My cell phone was smashed to pieces. My face bled from a gash above my left eyebrow. The doors refused to open because of the debris piled against them. I struggled for what felt like ages before I finally kicked out the driver's side window. With the adrenaline surging in my veins, I crawled through the shattered glass and onto the drenched ground. The rain was relentless and the night was pitch black. Eventually, I managed to limp to higher ground, where I spent hours under a half-collapsed porch of what once had been a fisherman's shack. I must have drifted in and out of consciousness. When I woke again, the storm had passed, but the roads were impassable. I had injured my leg, and my entire body felt numb. It took a day and a half before a search and rescue helicopter finally spotted me near a battered trailhead. They airlifted me to a hospital 2 hours away. My wallet had fallen somewhere in the wreck. My phone was gone. For a couple of days, I was delirious from blood loss and shock. During that time, news must have traveled back incorrectly. The local authorities found my rental car on the cliff's edge, half buried and nearly swept into the sea. Early reports indicated there was no sign of the driver. Witnesses assumed the car's occupant had been washed away. By the time I was coherent enough to contact Clara, she had already received a visit from law enforcement telling her that my vehicle had been discovered with no trace of me. Perhaps they stressed that the chances of finding someone alive under those conditions were slim. In the confusion, it must have sounded like I had simply vanished forever. I never blamed her or my sons for thinking I was gone. I might have believed the same if the situation were reversed. But the real shock was still to come. After my physical recovery, after the surgeries to patch up my busted knee and to remove a piece of glass near my ribcage, after I had spent 3 months going through rehabilitation. The entire ordeal spanned the better part of half a year, and by the time I finally arranged to come home, the life I knew had dissolved like salt in water. When I walked through my front door, a wave of nostalgia and sorrow washed over me. The living room smelled different, like a faint trace of some new cologne or cleaning product that Clara never used before. The photos of us as a couple, with our grown sons, were all still there on the mantle, but the energy in the house felt off. I felt like I was intruding in a place that had once been mine. I set my duffel bag down, leaning on a cane. My right knee still screamed with pain whenever I put weight on it the wrong way. I called out her name. "Clara, honey, I'm home!" My voice echoing in that stillness. She didn't respond. For a flicker of a moment, I allowed myself the fantasy that she had stepped out to get groceries. My heart raced with anticipation of seeing her face, imagining her shock at discovering I was alive and well. I had practiced the speech in my head so many times during my stay at the rehabilitation center. I would hold her hands, reassure her that the nightmares were over, promise her that the man she married was back for good. But fate had a more harrowing scene in store. It was another full day before I caught up with Clara. My older son Mark arrived later that night, winded and speechless, tears in his eyes when he saw me. He nearly knocked me over with a hug, gasping, "Dad, I can't believe it. Oh God, I can't believe it." The emotion in his voice humbled me. I had worried that my family might have moved on, and in a way, Mark had tried. But the relief he showed at my return was genuine. He told me about the funeral service, a symbolic one, since they never found my body. He mentioned how devastated Mom had been, how she kept to herself for weeks, barely eating. Then he grew quiet, biting his lower lip as though unsure if he should speak the words swirling in his mind. I insisted he tell me everything. There is only so much heartbreak a man can endure before he demands the truth, no matter how ugly. He explained that a few months after the authorities declared me missing, Clara began spending time at the local hospital, volunteering in some new capacity that didn't involve books. She claimed she needed to keep busy. She made new acquaintances, and one of them was Dr. Mathers, a well-regarded physician in his early 50s who had just transferred to our small town. Clara had confided in him about her grief. From what Mark knew, their relationship had started innocently enough, a shoulder for her to cry on, someone who understood sorrow because he had lost his wife to cancer years before. But soon, the community chatter hinted that they were more than friends. My younger son, Andrew, had confronted her, but she insisted that the good doctor was just offering emotional support. Then she started disappearing for long weekends. She told Mark she was visiting a cousin out of state. The truth came out when Mark went to the hospital to donate blood one afternoon. He saw Clara and Dr. Mathers standing in a hallway, holding hands like lovesick teenagers. When he asked her what was going on, she broke down and admitted that she and the doctor had developed feelings for each other. She justified it by saying she felt alone, as though fate had taken me away, leaving her desperate for human connection. I listened, each word thudding in my chest like a hammer. Mark apologized for not telling me earlier, but how could he when he believed I was dead? I embraced him again, telling him he did nothing wrong. At that moment, I harbored no particular ill will toward Clara. I was hurt, yes, but I rationalized. She thought I was gone forever. She was lonely. People make mistakes under emotional duress. I was prepared to forgive, convinced that our nearly 40 years together warranted another chance. But my capacity to forgive shattered that very night when Clara finally came home. It was late. She walked in wearing a stylish skirt I had never seen, her hair done up, smelling of an unfamiliar perfume. Even before turning on the light, she must have sensed something was off. My suitcase in the hallway, a subtle shift in the air. I spoke from the living room, my voice startling her into dropping her keys. The look on her face when she saw me standing there was not the tearful joy I had envisioned. Instead, it was a mixture of shock, fear, and something else. Dismay, perhaps. She stumbled over her words, stammering, "Oh my God, you're alive?" Then she burst into tears, but I could tell they weren't entirely tears of happiness. Her reaction rattled me. I had braced myself for a complicated reunion, but I hadn't expected a wave of guilt emanating from her like a pungent odor. We embraced, though her hug felt stiff, as if she were hugging a stranger, not the man who had shared a life with her for nearly 4 decades. In that moment, I felt the first seeds of anger sprouting in my chest, small but definite. She tried to explain how she had mourned me, how the funeral had offered no closure since there was no body to bury. She insisted she had remained faithful for as long as she could stand the loneliness. But as she spoke, her excuses began to feel rehearsed, or at least carefully arranged, the way a practiced speaker lines up points in a debate. When she finally mentioned Dr. Mathers, she tried to soften the blow by pointing out his compassion, his empathy for her situation, and how the relationship just happened. That was the moment my anger blazed like a fresh wound doused in salt. She used that phrase, "it just happened," as if the entire fiasco was an unfortunate slip on a wet floor, something neither of them could have prevented. I could have forgiven an honest admission of weakness, but this brand of justification was unbearable. I looked her in the eyes, through all those tears and the trembling lip, and realized that she had made a choice. She had chosen him. My apparent death gave her a free pass, or so she thought, and she was not sorry for the act itself, only sorry that it led to this confrontation. I slept in the guest room that night, or tried to sleep. In reality, I lay there fuming, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the last time I had sat on that very bed. It must have been months, maybe a year before my accident, when I changed the sheets in there for guests. Everything felt foreign, from the furniture arrangement to the heavy silence in the walls. That was when the plan began to form in my mind. At first, it was a vague concept, an idea that I wouldn't simply let this betrayal go. I could have demanded a divorce, but no, that would be too simple. After everything we shared, after giving her almost 40 years of my life, I deserved better than to just walk away. Yet, I also knew I could never remain in a marriage tainted by that brand of disloyalty. I would not degrade myself by staying with someone who had moved on so quickly. Revenge, however, was an interesting concept. It wasn't about physically harming anyone. I'm no brute, but I wanted Clara to feel something akin to the devastation I felt. I wanted her new lover to witness the consequences of his opportunistic seduction. And I wanted to do it in a way that left them with no illusions about whom they had wronged. The next morning, I told Clara we needed to talk, but she avoided me by leaving early for the community center. I knew from overhearing her phone conversation that she'd likely meet Dr. Mathers at the hospital later. Mark tried to mediate, stepping into the living room and saying, "Dad, she's been through a lot. Maybe give her a little time." I almost laughed. What about me? I was the one who had nearly died, the one who spent months recuperating in a hospital bed with rods in my knee, haunted by nightmares of being buried alive in my car. When I returned, I discovered my wife had replaced me with another man, but I held my tongue. My son meant well, and I appreciated his concern. He had no idea the storm of bitterness roiling inside me, how my old self had died on that cliff the moment my beloved decided to welcome another man into our bed. The only part of me left was the side that demanded retribution. I waited a few days, allowing Clara to stew in the awkwardness of my presence. I fielded phone calls from old friends who had heard rumors of my return. I scheduled a few medical follow-ups. When Clara and I finally spoke again, she said she felt guilty but also confused. She told me she needed to sort out her feelings and that she had grown closer to Dr. Mathers than she ever thought possible. She actually looked me in the eye and said, "I love you, but I also might love him." I felt my throat tighten as though someone had slipped a noose around it. All I could say was, "Then you've made your choice." I turned and left her alone in the kitchen, her eyes brimming with tears. If she had believed I was going to raise my voice, plead, or try to salvage what was left, she was sorely mistaken. My pity for her had fled. She was the one who had chosen to break our promise, not I. My first step was to protect my finances. Our accounts were mostly joint, but I had one separate account from my younger days that held a modest sum of inherited money. I quietly transferred a sizable chunk of our joint savings into my separate account, telling the bank manager that I wanted to consolidate funds for a specialized medical procedure. They didn't pry for details, and I had the right to move money around since my name was on every account. Next, I made an appointment with an old buddy, Joel, who happened to be a divorce attorney. I told him to keep our conversation confidential. I explained the situation, leaving out the rawer details. Joel nodded sympathetically and said, "We can get you a favorable settlement, especially given the circumstances." But I wasn't only after a simple settlement. Joel looked a bit uneasy when I asked if he could recommend a private investigator. I gave him a reassuring half laugh, told him I only wanted to gather evidence to document the affair thoroughly for legal leverage. Joel agreed to put me in touch with someone discreet. I still slept in the guest room. My presence in the house felt spectral, like I was a ghost haunting the corridors. I'd see Clara in passing, share a polite nod, maybe exchange a few words about the mail or the groceries, but nothing else. I spent most of my time in my makeshift office, rummaging through old photos and scanning them onto my computer, as though collecting proof of the life I once had. At night, my mind wandered to old memories, our wedding day, the births of our sons, even silly arguments we'd had about the color of drapes. I found myself torn between heartbreak and mounting anger. Each time I recalled how she had begun an affair with a doctor, the betrayal scalded my insides. My resentment swelled anew. I would press my cane against the floor, feeling the dull pain in my knee, and vow that I would not leave this marriage with only emotional bruises. The private investigator, a woman named Susan Fields, was experienced in handling marital disputes. She assured me that she would gather all the photographic proof I needed if Clara continued seeing Dr. Mathers. Over the next few weeks, I watched from the shadows as the little pieces of my plan slid into place. Susan sent me pictures of Clara meeting Dr. Mathers at a country inn 2 towns over. Nothing explicit, but the embraces and kisses were enough to confirm an extramarital affair. I stored every file carefully on an external hard drive. Each image was a scalpel slicing away any last thread of pity I might have had for her. Then Susan dug deeper, discovering that Dr. Mathers' background wasn't as spotless as one might think. He had faced a malpractice lawsuit in another state years before, quietly settling out of court. She also found a trail of online interactions with other women, though none quite as serious as with Clara. That part gave me a flicker of dark satisfaction. It meant Dr. Mathers was a man who thrived on emotional vulnerability. He found women who were fragile, drew them in with gentle words, and feasted on their gratitude. When I felt I had enough material, I confronted Clara. It was late on a Saturday, the night sky clear and cold. She had just returned from running errands, the classic line she used nowadays. I sat in the living room, all the lights off except a single lamp, the folder of photos on the coffee table. She froze when she saw the evidence, the heartbreak spelled out so plainly in color prints. I told her calmly that I intended to file for divorce, that I had documented her affair thoroughly. She broke down, sobbing, and again tried to rationalize. "You can't blame me," she cried. "You were gone. They told me you had died." I listened, feeling my patience slip away. "But I'm not dead," I said, leaning forward to catch her eyes with mine. "And now you've forced me into burying this marriage." She tried to approach me, but I held up a hand. For a moment, she looked startled by the coldness in my expression. That was the look of a woman realizing that, while she had once been able to rely on my endless understanding, there was no mercy left. I filed the divorce papers the next Monday. But that was just the beginning. I had no intention of letting her slip away quietly into the arms of Dr. Mathers, free of consequences. I made sure to release the evidence, anonymously, of course, to the hospital board where Dr. Mathers worked. I made it look like a concerned citizen was reporting unethical behavior. The board launched an internal investigation. The local gossip channels caught wind of it, and soon enough, Dr. Mathers' name was on the lips of everyone in town. He seduced that poor widow, some said, though she wasn't even a widow at all. Others shrugged and said doctors have affairs all the time. But the scandal was enough to tarnish his reputation. Patients began asking for different physicians. A newspaper columnist wrote a sensational article titled "Doctor's Affair Exposed After Patient's Shocking Return." The hospital's administration disliked the publicity. Even though it wasn't strictly illegal for him to have a relationship with a grieving woman who wasn't his patient, the optics were dreadful. They placed him on administrative leave while they investigated potential misconduct. In a town like ours, professional reputation is everything. This was the first step in my revenge. In parallel, I made sure to let Clara know that my lawyers would not be kind. I instructed Joel to be relentless in ensuring that we divided our assets in a way that reflected her betrayal. She stood to lose the house she loved, along with any future claim to my inheritance. We had always shared everything, so I never had to hide or hoard resources. But now, I realized how important it was to protect myself. Clara was humiliated. Her name got dragged through the rumor mill as well. The story of my return from the dead, only to find my wife in the arms of another man, was too juicy for small-town folks to ignore. She had to endure people whispering behind her back. She had to see pity or judgment in the eyes of former friends. She even lost her volunteer role at the community center because the board decided the negative publicity was harmful to their image. I might have felt sorry for her if she had shown even a shred of genuine remorse, but by then, she was openly resentful toward me, blaming me for turning the town against her. I thought, good, let her stew. If she wanted to see me as the villain, so be it. I had done nothing but fight for my life on that cliff, only to come home and discover she had replaced me. I dreaded the day my sons would realize how far I was taking the revenge. But to my surprise, they stood by me. Andrew was more vocal in his condemnation of Clara, clearly furious that she had jumped into another man's arms so quickly. Mark struggled more with the conflict, torn between loyalty to me and empathy for his mother. Ultimately, however, he recognized the pain her betrayal caused me. I sat them down and explained everything, from the accident to the new life I found at home to the pictures I'd collected. I told them I was no saint, that I was unleashing a calculated plan to ruin Dr. Mathers's standing in the community, and that I had made sure to pressure the hospital to keep investigating him. I expected them to be horrified or to plead with me to find forgiveness. Instead, Andrew said quietly, "Mom made her choice. Do what you have to do, Dad." And Mark just nodded, tears in his eyes, and wrapped an arm around my shoulder. I felt a surge of gratitude that neither of them tried to shield their mother from the consequences. To them, Dr. Mathers was the intruder who had walked right into our family's grief and taken advantage of it. And Clara, for all her past virtues, had made a decision she would have to live with. Dr. Mathers tried to reach me. At first, he sent a polite email asking if we could meet and talk man to man. He suggested we could have an understanding that Clara's well-being was paramount. I refused to respond. Then he left a voicemail pleading that we stop the rumors that the public scandal was hurting both him and Clara, and that I should let bygones be bygones. His nerve was astonishing. Did he think we were going to shake hands and trade war stories? A month ago, I might have confronted him in person, demanding an apology or a fight, but not anymore. I preferred to remain a phantom, an invisible force orchestrating his downfall from afar. Eventually, he stopped trying to contact me. I heard that, thanks to the hospital board's findings, he was terminated. Something to do with a past pattern of unprofessional conduct that he had failed to disclose fully. My guess is that the malpractice lawsuit from his previous state re-emerged under new scrutiny. Without local support, he was finished. One day, I saw him in a cafe, looking haggard. The lines in his face were deeper. His hair, carefully styled before, looked messy. He spotted me, and our gazes locked. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but I just stared at him, unblinking. Then I turned and left. That was the last time I ever saw him. My divorce from Clara became final 2 months later. She had tried to negotiate, but Joel was too good at his job. By the end, I had secured the house. She was forced to move into a small apartment. I gave her some money, enough to avoid accusations of cruelty, but not enough to let her live comfortably without working. I wanted her to feel the weight of her betrayal every morning as she rose to see cramped walls and limited options. She tried to present a strong face in court, but her eyes glistened with tears more than once. As we walked out of that final hearing, she paused at the top of the courthouse steps, turning to me with a look of exhaustion. "I never intended to hurt you," she said, her voice trembling. "I thought you were never coming back." Her words made me laugh bitterly. "But I did come back," I reminded her, letting my voice stay low and steady. "You'll spend the rest of your life remembering that." She tried to say something else, but I just shook my head and walked away, feeling a strange sense of relief, even though my heart still ached. Months passed, and I slowly learned how to exist on my own after nearly 4 decades of marriage. The first real test came when I moved forward with selling the old house. I had won it in the divorce, but I couldn't bear to live there anymore, haunted by every memory that now felt like a lie. I listed it quietly with a small local real estate firm. The property still had some equity left, despite the older structure. It sold surprisingly fast. Once the papers were signed, I packed what belongings I wanted: a few photo albums, some books, personal documents, and little keepsakes of my son's childhood. Everything else I left behind or donated. I took nothing that reminded me of Clara. Our wedding album, the jewelry I had bought her over the years, all of it stayed. I didn't need keepsakes of a broken promise. I settled into a new condo closer to the city, small but modern with wide windows overlooking a decent skyline. My knee still twinges every morning, but I manage. I see my sons more often now. We grab lunch or watch a ball game whenever their schedules permit. Occasionally, Mark will ask if I regret how I handled things. Maybe he wonders if I took it too far, if my vengeance robbed me of my own peace. But the truth is, I feel strangely calm. I don't regret making sure Dr. Mathers's hypocrisy was exposed, and I don't regret ensuring Clara faced the legal and social consequences of her actions. She taught me a cold lesson. If you break a vow that has spanned nearly 4 decades, you should be prepared for a fierce backlash. Not long ago, I heard that Clara took a job as a library assistant in a neighboring town, something to pay the bills, I assume. A mutual acquaintance mentioned that she sometimes looks thin, as though she's not eating well. Part of me still aches when I hear that. After all, I'm not a monster. I'm a man who once adored her, who cherished her laugh and the way she used to rest her head on my shoulder during a slow dance. But that man died on that cliff, replaced by someone who learned the hard way that loyalty can vanish in a heartbeat. If she truly cared for me, truly believed in our union, she wouldn't have been so quick to entwine herself with another. I cling to that rationale whenever guilt pokes at me like a splinter. So, my story doesn't end on a note of forgiveness or reconciliation. I don't intend to mend fences or reflect on lost opportunities with sentimental regret. I'm not a man who forgives betrayal. I'm not proud of that, but I accept it. Life is short, and when you nearly lose yours under tons of rock and mud, you learn to take a clear stance on what you can or cannot abide. I couldn't abide her betrayal, nor could I abide the doctor's opportunistic intrusion into what should have been a family's time of mourning. The man who came home after that calamity was not the trusting soul who left. He was someone else, someone who demanded respect or exacted a price for disrespect. These days, I keep my routine simple. I wake early, limp around the condo to stretch out my knee, then brew my coffee. My living room is sparse, just a couch, a television, a lamp, and a shelf of my architecture books. In the afternoons, I'll read or listen to classical music. Sometimes I'll browse the internet and stumble across stories of people who cheated in times of crisis, who found fleeting comfort in the arms of strangers. They always talk about regrets, about lessons learned, about eventually letting bygones be bygones. Well, not me. I don't believe that every wound can be forgiven. Some betrayals are final, a line drawn so definitively that you don't cross back. My sons think I'm lonely, but loneliness feels safer than trusting the wrong person again. I'd rather dwell in solitude with my pride than in company with a broken spirit. From time to time, I have nightmares about the cliff and the swirling storm. I'll jolt awake, covered in sweat, convinced that I'm still pinned inside that crushed rental car. My heart gallops in my chest, and for a split second, I think, I should call Clara. She'll comfort me. Then, reality sets in. She's gone, or perhaps it's more accurate to say I let her go. That initial pang of loss stings, but it also reminds me why I had to do what I did. I get up, splash water on my face, and tell myself it's better this way. She made her choice, and I made mine. We are two strangers now, bound by distant memories. Maybe one day, when I'm too old to stand at a window and watch the city lights fade at dusk, I'll let myself wonder if I was too harsh, if I could have tried to salvage a fraction of our bond. But deep down, I know that the bond was broken, the vow torn. She had an affair with another man, believing I was dead, but I wasn't. I lived. And in doing so, I became a different creature, one who refused to pretend that betrayal could ever be excused. No, I won't forgive her, and that, ironically, is the only sense of closure I'll ever need.